Welcome to the Paideia Institute online lecture series. I think we can start. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Ashleigh Green this evening. Dr. Ashleigh Green received her PhD from the University of Melbourne in late 2020 with the assistance of an Australian postgraduate award and the Robert Anderson Trust Scholarship. Her research interests include the study of birds in classical antiquity and more generally what human-animal studies can reveal about societies both past and present. In 2021, she was the recipient of the Australasian Society for Classical Studies Early Career Award. In 2022, she became a virtual fellow of the Center for the History of Emotions. And in the same year, she was also the La Trobe Society Fellow at the State Library of Victoria, where she pursued a project on local history. She is currently a tutor in classics and archaeology at the University of Melbourne. Her PhD thesis has just been published as a monograph, Birds in Roman Life and Myth, the subject of today's talk. Without further ado, take it away, Ashleigh.
Thank you very much, Megan. Let me start by sharing my slides. We have a lot to get through, so I'm just going to jump straight into it, I think. The talk today is about birds in Roman life and myth. It's specifically going to explore auspices and the sacred chickens. So my book, which has just been published and I'm still very excited about it, I only came out a few months ago, this is examining the place of, well, as it says, birds in Roman religion, in Roman culture, in Roman life. So it's looking at the use of birds to express power, wealth, and status in ancient Rome, and also their place in Roman religion. It is multidisciplinary in nature. It looks at literature, art, faunal remains, and ornithology. And that last point about the inclusion of modern ornithological knowledge is quite important because, and I want to underline this, it considers real birds only. It's thinking about how Romans interacted with real birds and how they became incorporated into their culture, into their religion. The different chapters, number 1, omens, augury, and auspices, and then number 2, the augural chickens. These are the topics that we're going to be exploring together today, but I also want to tell you that there is a great deal that I won't be able to get to today, which is specifically on farming and aviculture, so how the Romans farmed birds, how they consumed them, also looking at fowling and bird catching, which was actually one of the more interesting chapters to write. That was very, very fun to research that one. And then also looking at pet birds and the use of birds to provide pleasure in some way, whether through appearance or song. So if you enjoy what I have to say today, I do encourage you to go to your local library and check this out. Now, let's get into it. And I'm going to warn you right off the bat that there's a lot of terminology to get through. Roman augural law is notoriously complicated. It is obsessed with rules. So I'm going to introduce you to the topic just by defining what am I talking about here. Number 1, the first thing we have to define is auspicium. What is auspicium? It is the right of a magistrate to consult the gods about a proposed public action. So when a magistrate is invested with power, that power is expressed through the phrase imperium auspiciumque. His imperium is his actual power, his authority to command, but he cannot exercise that imperium without first exercising auspicium, without first asking the gods for permission to wield that power. Augurium as well, this is the right of an augur, which is a type of priest, to consult the gods about a proposed public investiture. But this is, it's a whole topic in itself. So today we're just going to focus on auspicium. So auspices have to be taken before any public business can be carried out. It's a way of checking that the gods are favorably disposed towards an action, and there are enormous consequences for going contrary to the auspices. Now, while I am concentrating on public auspices, a magistrate who is consulting the gods on a matter of state, I also want to point out that there are private auspices as well, that any man can take auspices pertaining to his own business, but the public auspices, this is the thing that they're really fighting over. and what is most important here. Now, there are three things to flag before I move on. Number one is that taking auspices is not mystical or intuitive. It is not like consulting the Oracle of Delphi and working out what that means through some kind of interpretation. There are strict rules that govern how you should interpret different signs. It's all written down in enormous manuals. There are augurs who have memorized all of these different signs and what they mean. So it's not intuitive and it's not mystical. It's considered more of a law or a science. The second thing to note is that auspices are valid for one day only. The auspicial cycle runs from one midnight to the next. So if you are wanting to perhaps convene a meeting of the Senate, you take the auspices and the gods say no, you can try again the next day. It's only valid for 24 hours. The third thing that we need to know is that you're not divining the future when you take the auspices. You are just looking to get a yes or no answer. Can I take this action? Yes or no. And if the answer is no, of course, try again in 24 hours. So that's the foundational knowledge that we need. The next thing we need to think about is the types of auspices. And number one, there are two main types of auspices into which these different categories fall. Number one, there is impetrative auspices. These are auspices that are formally solicited during a ritual. And these first three, these are all impetrative. There are also oblative auspices. This is when an omen just happens to you spontaneously and you have to stop and figure out what that is about. Now, of course, the god of auspices is Jupiter, sky god of thunder and lightning. Therefore, thunder and lightning, the auspicia ex caelo, these are the strongest signs. However, thunder and lightning don't happen every day. So the vast majority of signs are coming from birds, from interpreting the flight and the cries of the wild birds. These are most commonly solicited in urban auspices, but there is a subset of this called the auspicia ex tripudiis, which is looking at the feeding patterns of chickens, most commonly solicited in military auspices. And of course, we'll get to the sacred chickens in a moment. These last two, like I said, these are oblative. We're not really worried about these at the moment, but it's just interesting to note that the strange behavior of mammals and any kind of strange occurrence, anything that seems significant to you, these are considered to be oblative auspices, signs from the gods. The fact that birds were providing the majority of signs is encoded into Roman mythology. Number one, of course, we have the founding of Rome itself, when Romulus and Remus took the auspices. And so the story goes, 12 vultures appeared to Romulus and only 6 appeared to Remus, which told everybody that Jupiter had chosen his king, and upon that space, Rome itself, the city itself, was founded by birds. And so this just has a quote of Romulus proposing that, you know, he and Remus should not fight. They should leave it to the wisdom of birds to decide. There is no need for contest, said Romulus. Great faith is placed in birds. We shall try the birds. Livy as well also provides an example of auspices being encoded into the Roman legal and political processes. He tells the story of Attis Navius, a very famous augur, who proved the wisdom of birds, and then afterwards it is said nothing was done at war or at home unless the auspices had been taken. Popular assemblies, musterings of the army, acts of supreme importance, all were put off when the birds refused their consent. So this is baked into the Roman political system. You cannot lawfully exercise your power without first asking the birds. Now that we have established this, we have to start asking some practical questions. How was this ritual conducted? Where did it take place? How do you interpret the different bird signs? Well, let's start with the question of where do you take the auspices? The answer to this is a templum, and there are two templa. There is the templum in caelo, the temple in the sky, which is the field of vision in which a magistrate or an augur is looking for bird signs. There is also an earthly templum, which is the physical space on which the augur or auspicant stands or sits, where they are looking up at the sky. Now, if you're thinking templum, is that where we get the English word temple from? Yes, it is, because temples, which are called aides, were often built on inaugurated templa, hence why our word temple means building. But it originally means the field of vision in which you're looking for birds. And here is one that I made earlier. This is my reconstruction of an augural templum based on the works of Mario Torelli and Jerzy Lindeski. So it was Mario Torelli, who excavated a site at a little place called Bunzi in southern Italy, called Buntia in Latin. He discovered a small grid of limestone pillars. So I've just used little pieces of wood to indicate what those look like, but imagine small limestone pillars sticking out of the ground about 12 inches or so. These limestone pillars mark the cardinal and solstitial points, and they have words carved into them, abbreviated words. Now, if I skip ahead, the most important thing to be aware of when you are using this templum to interpret the bird signs is that, actually, I'll go back. This on the right here, this is the field of vision when you are sitting here. So the auspicant, you can imagine them sitting here on the western line looking east. And this is the field of vision when you're sitting in that position. Interpreting the bird signs depends on whether they are on your left and your right. But remembering that Jupiter is the god of auspices, Jupiter also has a left and a right hand. And we are told that from the seat of the gods looking south, on the left-hand sides are the eastern parts of the world, and on the right hand, the western. So that left-hand auspices appear to be better than right-hand auspices. So Jupiter is imagined as a part of this ritual, sitting in the northern part of the sky, looking south, and his left and right hands are determining whether something is favorable, just as the auspicant's left and right hands are determining how you should interpret the sign as well. Really important to note here that the left hand is lucky for the Romans. This is opposite to what the Greeks believed. They looked north when they were divining, which put the east on their right-hand side. And so for the Greeks, the right-hand side was the lucky side. Romans had it backwards, or the Greeks had it backwards, depending on how you want to look at it. So now we can start examining this templum in a little bit more detail. And this is my full reconstruction of what all of the different signs mean. Now, it was Mario Torelli and Jerzy Lindeski that figured out what these signs mean, what they signified in Latin, and they were the ones that put together that, okay, so this is the destructive bird, this is the most fortunate bird. I did a little bit of extra work trying to figure out, okay, so we know what these signs mean, but why are they assigned that significance? Of course, it goes back to whether you are looking at the left or right hand. And what I figured out is that Jupiter's left and right hand controls whether the sign is good or bad, whereas the auspicant's left or right hands determine whether the sign is strong or weak. So northeast becomes the most fortunate bird. Northwest, strong and bad, becomes the destructive bird. And then on the western portion, instead of it being destructive, it's a bird that just says no but does not threaten calamity. We have a delaying bird which says try again another time. We have an allowing bird which says yes, but it's not as strong as the most fortunate bird. So that is how I've reconstructed it. But now we have to think about, okay, why are the left and right hands working in this way? To answer this question, we have to look at these three pillars here. The eastern half, this is marked by the augury pillar, dedicated to Jove, so dedicated to the sky, dedicated to the god of the sky. On the western half, we have dedicated to Flusa, which is an Oscan name for flora, so dedicated to the earth, which should tell us immediately that west equals earth equals bad, east equals the sky, the heavens equals good. What about this central pillar? Well, this is dedicated to the sun. And as you can see, there's no level of auspiciousness assigned to it because, of course, no bird can appear spontaneously in the center of the templum. And this marker dedicated to the sun, this is the key to unraveling how the auspices work. The auspiciousness is coming from whether the sign is in the east or the west, Jupiter's left or right hands. Now, this is easy to work out. Of course, the sun rises in the east, that's good. Sets in the west, that's bad. The strength and weakness corresponding to north and south aligns with the changing point of sunrise throughout the year, as you can see here illustrated beautifully on the right. So on the shortest day, when the sun is at its weakest, it's rising very far to the south. And on the longest day, when the sun is at its strongest, it's rising far to the north. So that allows us to account for why the auspicant's left and right hand is determining whether the sign is strong or weak. That central marker of the templum, Sole, is indicating that everything in auspices literally revolves around the sun, and that's how it works. But that is not the end of the story. We've established that it's the taking of auspices occurs in a templum. You're sitting there, turning your back on the west, looking east. You're taking this grid and using it as a guide. You're throwing that up into your field of vision, using that to interpret the different signs. But there are many, many, many other factors that determine how you should interpret the sign. Number one is whether you see a bird or whether you hear a bird. And Cicero tells us that the divine will causes those known as alites, which give omens by their flight, to fly hither and thither, and those known as oscines, which give omens by their cries, to sing now on the left and now on the right. So there are birds that will give their signs through their appearance or through where in the templum you can hear them. Left and right, we've already established that whether a bird is on your left and right hand is incredibly important, but also whether a bird is high flying or low flying is very important. And high flying is, of course, better than low flying. Finally, there are the birds themselves. I'll get into the actual augural birds in just a moment, but it's important to note that there is a hierarchy when it comes to the signs. So here is our example that says, if a barn owl or a woodpecker gave a sign at auspices, and then an eagle gave a contrary sign, the eagle's sign would prevail. I want to pause here for just a moment, because this, I think, is important to note that I almost like to think of this as a get out of jail free card, that if you are a magistrate who is wanting to get on with public business for the day and you receive a sign that is negative, you can just wait. You can wait for Jupiter to change his mind and send another bird. You might be waiting there for a while, but as soon as he sends a stronger sign that is positive, you can then break your line of sight, end the ritual, and say, okay, Jupiter changed his mind, let's get on with it. Whereas if you immediately receive a good sign, you can jump up, break your line of sight, end the ritual, and make sure that Jupiter doesn't have a chance to change his mind in the negative. So we can already see little instances where the Romans are gaming the system, that they have this hierarchy, they have this idea that, you know, Jupiter can change his mind and send a stronger sign later on. But also, I don't know if anyone noticed, it's interesting that the auspicant would sit turning his back on the west and looking east. So he is trying to maximize his chances of seeing a good sign by turning his entire gaze towards the east, the lucky part of the sky. The augural birds themselves. What's interesting here is that there are very few birds that were considered to be significant while taking auspices. And this was remarked upon by the Romans themselves. Seneca says, why is the honor of making auspices of important events given to very few birds, such as the eagle or the raven, while the voices of other birds are without prophetic meaning? And Cicero, in comparing Roman auspices to foreign auspices, says that foreign auguries are not so artful, but rather superstitious. They use all kinds of birds, we only a few. So what kind of augural birds were there? These are just some of the most important. I don't really have time to go into it all that in all that much detail, but vultures are the strongest and most fortunate signs. These are, of course, the birds that gave the signs that founded Rome. Eagles, I think we all know intuitively that eagles are extremely fortunate and strong for the Romans. Ravens have mixed significance. What's interesting about ravens is that they're considered to be right-hand birds. So they are lucky on the right, which is the opposite to most other birds. We also have woodpeckers, fortunate. They gave signs not by flight or cries, but by tapping on certain trees. Also crows, which are mixed and weak. Now, negative omens are usually furnished by owls. Romans hated owls. And they had 4 or 5 different species that they recognized, distinguishing between them on the basis of their cries. So I've just included this quote that we can go through quickly from Pliny, who says that the night birds have hooked talons, such as the little owl, the eagle owl, and the tawny owl. Now, the eagle owl, which is this fine fellow right here, Eurasian eagle owl, called a bubo in Latin, this was considered to be a fatal bird, the most abominable omen, especially at public auspices. We have indications that the Romans would purify the city if an eagle owl entered Rome. That is how seriously they took this as an omen. So the bubo is interesting, and I just wanted to bring it up because it could be it could not be positive under any circumstances. As Pliny tells us, when seen in cities or in daylight, in all circumstances, it is a deathly portent. But he adds quite sensibly, but I actually know of several cases where it has perched on a private house without fatal results. So I think the very fact that he is commenting that, it doesn't seem that death really follows this bird everywhere, I think indicates how much the Romans disliked and feared this animal. Smaller owls could sometimes give positive omens, but generally were negative in most circumstances. Okay. I am assuming that your impressions of Roman auspices so far is that they are incredibly complicated. And I haven't even got into all the different rules and caveats and all the different ways that, the sign could be interpreted, that the sign could be changed. Augural law is complicated. I think we all can agree on that. Not only that, there is a sense that how did the Romans get anything done when they had to stop and consult the birds before they could, take any public action? Well, it gets even stranger when we consider that a general had to take auspices while he was in the field, before he could lawfully exercise his powers, before he could cross rivers, before he could go into battle, and at many other critical junctures, he had to stop and ask the birds. This, of course, causes a problem for generals who are trying to maneuver quickly in enemy territory. There's far too much that is left to the chance appearance of a bird. And this is where the chickens come into play. The name for auspices taken from chickens is tripudium. And this is important. I'll get into this in just a moment. But what we have to understand, first of all, is that Roman augural law is incredibly ancient. It's as ancient, at least, as the founding of Rome itself, and probably comes from a system that existed before that. It's unchanging. Romans don't like innovation. They have all of their rules, they have the laws written down, and there's no room for bringing in new augural birds. So if Cicero is telling us that ancient augurs did not use chickens, if we know as well that chickens were introduced into the Italian peninsula in about the 8th or 9th century BCE and did not become widespread until about the 3rd century BCE, then something's going on here. How were they able to incorporate chickens into this ancient and unchanging system? Well, this brings us to the word tripudium. The name for auspices taken from chickens, tripudium, Cicero tells us this is derived from terram pavire, which means to strike the ground. And basically, according to an old law, if any bird dropped something in front of an auspician, it didn't have to be one of the augural birds that I mentioned before. If any bird dropped something, then instantly you would call that a most favorable omen. So chickens are introduced on this technicality. If I am taking the auspices and I just bring out a chicken and there just happens to be some food there and it happens to peck at the food and some of that food happens to fall from its beak, well, technically a bird has dropped something in front of me and I can declare that a most favorable omen. This is where the sacred chickens come from. Now, when you are dropping the food in front of the chickens, when they are eating it and the food is falling from their mouths, we're told that they're fed a special meal called pulse, which translates to porridge, or sometimes offer, translates to cake. Special mixtures made of grains and lentils that seem to be designed to crumble and fall apart when pecked at. And ideally as well, it's noted that these grains would make a pleasing rattle as they hit the ground. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, gosh, that seems deeply cynical, the idea that you can game the auspices and force this omen to appear in front of you, the Romans were aware of it as well. Cicero tells us that our magistrates use forced auspices and that it is necessary that scraps of cake should fall from the mouths of chickens when eating. What's interesting as well is that Varro even tells us that the reason that chickens were raised in the first place was for the use in augury. And some of the zooarchaeological evidence does seem to bear this out. Chickens don't become widespread in the use of, for production of food and eggs until a lot later. It really does seem that they were used in these special rituals first and foremost, and then became food-producing animals. And just to prove to you how easy it is to get a most favorable omen, here are some auspices that I took earlier. So this is me just feeding my chickens. And look, they're already, food has fallen from their beaks. So within about 5 seconds of feeding these chickens, sorry, the cow in the background, within about 5 seconds of feeding these chickens, I can clap my hands and declare most favorable omen, and I can proceed with my business. So this was a really, really handy expedient to just watch it again. This was a really handy expedient to get all of those legal and religious prerogatives fulfilled. I just had these in case the video didn't work. My lovely little chickens. Chickens, of course, then became very potent symbols of victory. And it's worth stressing that they were integral when it came to the movements of the Roman army. A general could not lawfully exercise his power without first taking the auspices. And if chickens are providing those auspices, then that tells us that they're consulting them fairly regularly. They're taking them along with the army. And here is just one example. This is Republican Ice Signatum celebrating a naval victory. The chickens pecking at the ground, of course, indicating that they're giving the favorable omens necessary to go into battle. And if I skip ahead again, this is a grave of a Pularius, which is a chicken keeper. Because of course, if you've got this almost industry around transporting fowl along with the army, if you have to consult them at the drop of the hat, if a general is relying on them to move quickly in the field, then someone has to care for those animals. And so there is a role, a Pularius, that was an incredibly important, high status role in the Roman army. Here we have Marcus Pompeius Asper. He has included this on his tombstone. He has included the chickens on his tombstone. So he is incredibly proud of this particular role. The Pularius would have been in the close confidence of the general, would have been at his beck and call, and it was his responsibility to transport the fowl, to take care of them, to make sure that they were ready at a moment's notice, and particularly to make sure that they were kept hungry, because the general wanted the auspices at a moment's notice. So the best way to do that is to make sure the hens are always hungry. Cicero even tells us that they were deliberately starved. So this was a known practice to keep them hungry, to make sure that they would eat whenever the general needed that positive answer. Now, I am giving you the impression that chickens were fairly foolproof, that they would give those positive auspices quite reliably. And this is true. However, there are a number of instances where chickens either give a negative answer or something goes wrong with the ritual. This example here is from Valerius Maximus, who tells us that a general tried to take the auspices, but the chickens, once released from their cage, fled into a nearby wood and could not be recovered. This was said to augur a lost battle. On the right here, we have another famous example of Gaius Flaminius, who tried to take the auspices, and it seems that his chicken keeper, his Pularius, actually sabotaged the auspices and had stuffed the birds with food to make sure they wouldn't give a positive answer. And so we have Flaminius's sneering response to this, where he says, "Splendid auspices indeed, to counsel action when the chickens are starving and no action when satiated." So things could go wrong. There's also another example of a general who tried to take the auspices at night. And anyone who has kept chickens understands that chickens don't eat at night. You know, they don't do anything at night. They go into this trance-like state and you can't wake them up. That is a whole other story that I can't go into, but that's another example of things going wrong, that you can't take the auspices at night. The most famous example of things going wrong with the auspices, however, is, of course, Claudius Pulcher disregarding the auspices and drowning the sacred chickens. Now, this is part of the First Punic War. Claudius Pulcher wants to go into battle. He wants to engage in a naval battle with the Carthaginians. And he brings out the chickens and he expects that they will give him that positive answer, that he's just looking to get this legal requirement out of the way and move on with his day. But the chickens don't eat. And I believe the reason for this is because chickens get motion sickness. So I think the poor things were probably quite seasick. And that is why they did not give Claudius the auspices that he wanted. The story goes that Claudius, in a rage, then declared, if they won't eat, let them drink. And he threw them overboard and he drowned them. Then he went into battle contra auspicia, contrary to the auspices, and lost disastrously. He was then trialed for impiety and for his disregard of the auspices, made to pay a huge fine, and then I believe committed suicide in disgrace. So the lesson here, never do something contrary to the auspices. Always listen to the chickens. Now, this particular story is one of the most famous stories about the sacred chickens, but there are a few misunderstandings around it. It's sometimes said that Claudius was punished for killing the sacred chickens, for killing sacred animals, but that's not what happened. Claudius went contrary to the auspices. The killing of the chickens was not really what was wrong. It was the fact that he went contrary to the will of the gods, which brings us, somewhat controversially, I think, to the question of whether the chickens were even sacred at all. And I hope you're not going to boo me and throw me out of this Zoom meeting for saying that actually the chickens weren't sacred. My research suggests that they weren't sacred at all. The name for the sacred chickens is pulli. Now, this literally translates to pullets or young hens, because these are the animals that the Romans preferred. The word for a mature hen, of course, is gallina or gallinae in Latin. The Romans did not use roosters. They never used male birds. They also avoided those gallinae, those older hens, because those might turn broody and refuse to leave the cage. Young hens are the most reliable. They can be trusted to leave the cage and peck happily at grain when required. And any are suitable for the job. So when you hear the word sacred chickens, I don't want you to imagine creatures that are, raised in temples and pampered and considered to be extraordinary or special. These are utilitarian creatures. They are vehicles through which divine will can manifest, but they are not special in and of themselves. And considering Cicero tells us that the chickens were stuffed into cages and starved, that is not really how you would treat a sacred animal. So I argue that sacred chickens is actually a mistranslation. They're not special animals. And I also compare this to the fact that when you're taking auspices from wild birds, if you see a crow while you're taking auspices from wild birds, that crow is not instantly considered to be sacred. It is just significant at the moment you are taking the ritual. But as soon as the ritual ends, it is no longer significant. Unfortunately, the chickens are not sacred. I prefer to translate pulli as augural hens, augural chickens. However, I hope I haven't disappointed too many of you by saying that the chickens weren't sacred. The good news is that there do seem to be special chickens, maybe not sacred, but there do seem to be some special chickens, which are connected to none less than Augustus himself. So I'll read this particular passage to you. This is a very, very famous omen that occurred in the ancient world. I think I found 7 or 8 different sources that tell this story in mostly the same way. So this was quite well known, this particular omen. we are told that shortly after Empress Livia's marriage to Augustus, when she was returning to her estate near Veii, an eagle swooped past and dropped into her lap a white hen, which was holding a sprig of laurel in its beak. This bird she cared for, and the sprig of laurel she planted, hatching such a great brood of chicks from the hen that the villa is now called the hen house, Villa ad Gallinas. And such a grove of laurel grew that thereafter triumphant Caesars plucked from it their laurels. The custom was that after triumphs, they would then plant them in the same place. We have to pause here for a moment because something is going on with this omen. There is a strong whiff of martial glory and triumph and victorious symbolism to this. And the laurel itself, that speaks for itself. I think we all know what that represents. Augustus would have plucked laurel from this grove as he was celebrating his triumphs. Later Caesars also did the same. Now, these birds, these white chickens, remembering that chickens are potent symbols of victory, I believe that what this particular omen is alluding to, what this story is alluding to, is the fact that Augustus and Livia cultivated a special flock of distinctive white hens for use in augural rituals. The reason I believe that is because white birds were not favored by the Romans. They are pretty staunch on the fact that white birds are easier for predators to spot. They're not as hardy. The chickens that they preferred in farming contexts were red hens. And so the fact that this bird is white, that it's distinctive, something's going on here. Most of the chickens that would have been available in the ancient world would have been red or black. So something's going on with the fact that these are white. I think Augustus is specifically trying to cultivate a distinctive flock of chickens here. And we have some evidence that may prove indeed that Livia did breed these chickens for use in the auspices. Or if she didn't do it herself, then she had people cultivating them for her. We are told that on the western portion of the Viminal Hill, there existed a street or district called Gallinae albi, white hens. And Livia's villa was also sometimes known by this name. So it is possible that they were bringing chickens from Livia's villa into the city for use in rituals. And on this point, it's important to stress that even though the chickens were used mainly in military auspices, even though that is where they were first used, in the late Republic into the Empire, we see chickens are used more and more often to provide public auspices as well, the urban auspices. That the chickens were what the magistrates were relying on. They started to move away from looking at wild birds, from sitting in the templum and observing the sky. They started to just use this handy expedient, this loophole of the chickens in everyday urban auspices. And we have an interesting allusion to this possible significance of the white chickens from an odd insult by Juvenal, where he says that, do you believe you deserve special treatment just because you're the son of a white hen, while we poor pullets were hatched from less auspicious eggs? Now, if we know that farmers did not prefer white hens, that they sort of dismissed them as not as productive, easier for predators to spot, then I think the special status of the white hen that he's talking about must be related to their use in the auspices. I think it was known in the ancient world, in imperial Rome, that if you see white chickens, those come from Augustus's flocks, and these indicate that the gods are on the side of Augustus. And here we have a depiction of Augustus with a chicken. This is Augustus taking the auspices before a military campaign to the east. And while we have no way of knowing what color that bird is, my money would be on the fact that it is white. I think that's definitely a white chicken, reminding everyone of the omen that was given to Livia, reminding everyone that Augustus is the author of all Roman victories, and that even his chickens provide the auspices for all victories as well. You know, Augustan propaganda never sleeps. He would never miss an opportunity to impress upon people his favored status. And so I think that these white hens were indeed a special kind of chicken cultivated just for the auspices. Coming towards the end of this lecture, I've done a lot of work in demystifying the sacred chickens, I think. When people first hear about the sacred chickens, there can be this sense that how could the Romans be so foolish as to believe that these chickens were special, or that they had, you know, advice to offer a general? Why is a general relying on chickens to plan his battle strategies? Well, what I hope this talk has shown to you is that it's not mystical. It's not the Romans being superstitious. This is actually the most reliable way to bypass all of those complicated auspicial rules. It's the best way to satisfy all legal and religious prerogatives while virtually guaranteeing, you know, accepting those few examples that we looked at, you know, like Claudius Pulcher, most of the time you could rely on the chickens to give you a positive result. So we can see that the chickens are actually fairly utilitarian, that this is the Romans dealing with the fact that they're hamstrung by this complicated legal and religious system, and they are using the chickens to bypass that. I think the use of chickens is actually fairly sensible once you put it into the context of augural birds. But even though I have done some work demystifying the chickens, I want to stress again that the chickens were used daily in ancient Rome, not only to provide the auspices necessary to go into battle, but also, as I mentioned before, increasingly used in the urban auspices to grant the divine stamp of approval, to do things like convene a meeting of the Senate or muster the army or whatever it might be. And I've even included the Latin in this particular quote, just in case you don't believe what I'm about to tell you. Pliny, when talking about chickens, tells us the most favorable omens come from chickens. They daily rule our magistrates and close or open their own houses to them. They impel or hold back the Roman fasces, order or forbid battle, are the auspices of all our victories in the whole world. Imperio, imperant, chickens rule over the greatest empire of the world. And on that stunning quote, I shall now open it up to questions. Megan, will you be emceeing, or will I just take whichever questions appear first?
People can raise their hands with the raise hand feature, or you can just jump in.
I think I saw Bill Linney.
Hi, thanks for a great lecture. When you showed the grave marker of the, I believe you said he was a Pularius, the guy who's, it had a 3x3 diagram on it, which it looked like the templum in the field when you had the templum. It looked like that. It was that, which is also a 3x3. You know what I mean? Is there any connection?
I have not been able to work that out, but I also noticed that similarity. I think it's very possible that there may be some kind of connection there. If we go back again, another thing we can look at here is this star, this 3x3 star. You know, if you draw a line through all of this, there's something going on. Perhaps these representations of the templum grid are used to indicate auspices, or that this is happening under some kind of divine, auspices here. I think you're right. I think something is going on. I think that that may be an indication of some kind of symbol connected to the templum, connected to this particular 8-pointed star, but I don't know any more than that. I haven't been able to make any more conclusions, unfortunately.
Could it be a tiny miniature version of the larger outdoor templum that you showed? What do you call the 3x3 stone? You said they're like little short columns that stick up about a foot out of the ground. Was there a name for that?
The columns themselves? No, just the whole thing was called the templum. I think that might be, you might be onto something there, because they did build these temporary structures in the camp to take the auspices. So it may indeed be a representation of the space in which auspices from the chickens were taken, but I don't know enough to say for sure. Yeah.
On the Polarius's grave marker, there was a 3x3 thing, and then at the top there were two faces. Ah, yeah, there it is. So
that's what we're talking about here.
Just for fun, I'm just, throwing out there the idea of, is that somehow related, and who are the...
And who are they? Yeah. I think absolutely. I have looked at this myself, but I don't know any more than this, and I haven't been able to find any other representations that look like this. Perhaps this is representing Jupiter and the auspicant. Perhaps it's representing the Polarius and the general as they're watching the chickens in this field. I think it is connected to the sacred chickens, but again, I don't know any more than that. I can't say for sure.
Okay, I'm just throwing that out there as a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. I think next there's a question from Rebecca.
Hi, Dr. Green. Thank you so much. This was so fascinating. I am really curious about how the Romans might have contextualized it. Is there anything in the information or archaeology or historical record in the event that the auspicial chickens gave a favorable omen and then a non-favorable military result occurred? Did they experience this, and how would they have thought about that? Did they have like follow-up practices for divining then what the next sequence of events should be?
They absolutely did have cases where the chickens gave a positive answer and then they lost the battle. But generally, this could be explained away that, perhaps the general did something wrong later on. They always had a way to explain that this is why it went wrong. But no one ever questioned auspices themselves. Even Cicero, who is very, very skeptical and, indicates that this is a little bit silly. We all know that we're just getting a positive answer, that, they're not actually interpreters of the will of Jove. He still says that augury and auspices should be one of the two pillars of our republic, So they just found ways to explain it away. The only thing that they ever got really upset at was when they did not get the assent of the chickens before they went into battle, as we see from Claudius Pulcher. But if you went into battle with their assent, they just explained it away. They never really lingered on it.
Fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we have another raised hand, and then there are a few questions in the chat.
Is that Kieran?
Yes, that's me, ma'am. I was wondering in particular, was there any attempts by Romans to design enclosed templa that might prevent any well, not necessarily, I know that they relied a lot on wild signs as their laws dictated, but did they ever stop to consider that maybe relying on wild signs would be a bit too random, and thus designed enclosed spaces with only a few pre-designated birds that might have been simpler at any times?
Not that I have found, no. The place that they took the auspices always had to be out of doors. And so it's sort of hard to then build an enclosed space around that. The most important thing is that you have an unobstructed view of the sky. It's really, really important that the sky is not obstructed. So you can imagine as soon as you put any kind of structure there that might contain wild birds, that instantly negates the auspices because you have obstructed the sky. The chickens seem to be the way that they get around this, that instead of relying on those wild birds, they would just bring out a domesticated bird, it drops something from its mouth, you declare most favorable auspices and you move on. The chickens were the only way that I have found that they managed this and used a loophole to get around these incredibly complicated rules.
Very well.
Thank you. I think Mark is next.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Green, for your talk. I've had a long fascination with all the puzzles and paradoxes of Roman religion. I don't have a question so much as I would like to just push back a little bit when you say, because I don't feel you've really demystified the chickens for me. And what I mean by that, I sort of have in the back of my head Theophrastus is superstitious man, the man who's afraid of the gods. And the Romans are so, they have that same kind of fear, but the fact that it's rule governed just seems to me that, like a psychological explanation would be they're trying to control it. Like there's a tremendous amount of fear here of the unknown, of the battle, or whatever your decision is. And this attempt at control, I don't know. There's some weird mysticism going on there somewhere.
Yes, perhaps it was a little bit overblown to suggest that I have demystified it, because it is still such a strange practice to our modern eyes. The idea that religion, politics, the daily operations of the state depend upon such a strange ritual. I think you're absolutely right, Mark, and I think you're right to make that comment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for just a few more. I think next is Meredith.
Hi, thank you. This is fascinating. I once had the luck to audit a class with Morton Smith at Columbia on magic in ancient cultures, but he did not mention any of this. So I'm wondering, I know Athena was associated with an owl. Was Minerva also the owl being so unlucky?
Yes. But the Romans differentiated between quite a number of owls. So Athena's owl was the little owl. Athena noctua is the scientific name. Quite small, very cute, beautiful, big green eyes. The Romans as well also connected her with the tawny owl, which has a very distinctive ululating cry that it makes, and is also quite small and cute. So those owls could be positive through connection to Minerva, but were generally considered negative. And then you get the bigger owls like the eagle owl, where they just could not be positive under any circumstances. And the eagle owl as well was not associated with Minerva. It was this horrid, monstrous beast. I cannot overstate how badly they reacted to eagle owls. They would purify the entire city if one entered Rome. That is how much they feared eagle owls. It's really interesting.
We have time for two more, I think. Next is Heather.
Hello, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. So one of my favorite places in Rome is the room in the Roman History Museum with the garden mural from the Villa ad Gallienus, which is, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a wraparound, full color, life-size fresco from Livia's villa depicting a garden, a lush garden full of birds. And I've been really fascinated, and the reason, asking the question, what is the reason that Romans covered their walls with these garden paintings with birds in them. And I was wondering if
well, to answer that, you'll have to read my book.
Okay, so if you have, okay, I will read your book for sure. I'm wondering if you could share any insights you might have on whether those types of artworks were connected to augury or the auspices. And if so, I'm wondering why I don't see more representations of chickens. By my reading of about this work, I have seen only wild birds in at least that fresco.
Mm-hmm. So the short answer, are the birds in these garden scenes representing augural scenes? No. Because if you recall, only a few birds are actually significant when you're taking auspices. If I go back, where is it? They tell us here that only a few birds are actually significant when you're taking auspices. When the Romans are covering their walls in these garden scenes and with these birds, they're essentially trying to recreate the pleasure of the garden experience within their own houses. What's really interesting about Livia's wall paintings that you've mentioned there, absolutely stunning, by the way. Everyone here should go and visit them if you go to Rome. What's really interesting about them is that they're presenting an ideal. So they have different birds, different migratory birds, and different fruits and flowers all there at the same time when they would not all be there in nature. So it's really representing this idealized scene, and it indicates how much the Romans took pleasure in their gardens. What's interesting as well as about these representations of birds is how extraordinarily accurate they are. This isn't just a painter who is doing an outline of a random bird. You can look at them and you can see golden orioles, you can see robins, you can identify all of the different species. It's just extraordinary how profoundly accurate they are when they represent these birds. But yes, if you want to know more, read my book. Chapter 5, Pleasure, looks at that.
Yeah, I'm really excited to learn more about the birds in these paintings, and so I'm excited that your book is going to address them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Heather.
Great. Okay, last question from Jane.
Yes, hi. This is fun. Birds are always fun. I think there's an awful lot of Etruscan at the bottom of all this, and so much is derived from the Etrusca disciplina, and we have many representations of augurs taking the auspices. One of the most famous shows a priest standing with one foot raised and the other at right angles, presumably oriented toward the cardinal points, and he holds a liver in his hands. And we know from the Piacenza liver that they marked out the liver with the to align the cardinal points with the templum, and then the different sectors of the liver were marked out as dominated by certain gods. So they used the liver as a kind of handheld templum or handheld Stonehenge, so aligned to the heavens and the cardinal points that they could read the omens in their hands. So I think that's an interesting, the Etruscan connection is one that is very deep. I was surprised to see also the Oscan influence.
Yes, the Oscan influence is because the only templum that we have ever recovered was in the south. So that explains why they were using an Oscan dialect on the different Latin on the inscriptions. But I'm so glad that you brought up the Etruscan influence, because yes, absolutely. This did not occur in isolation. It was not invented by the Romans in isolation. It is absolutely born out of the Etruscan discipline. But the fascinating thing is that the Romans did not like to admit that. They insisted that their law was their own and that they were not influenced by the Etruscans. They said this practice is staunchly Roman. But as you said, Jane, when you look at the evidence, the similarities are striking and far too striking to be coincidence. So that is fascinating. Yes, there is an Etruscan influence, but also the Romans insisted that there wasn't, which I think speaks to some of the perhaps xenophobia that's going on there.
Yes, and it's much easier to travel with some chickens than a whole flock of sheep, I suppose. You're going to be
Exactly.
taking Omen.
Well, thank you so much, Ashleigh, for this fantastic talk. This was, highly anticipated. So it was a pleasure to have you, and thank you all for attending, of course, and we'll see you again very soon. The next online lecture is August 11th, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Allegra, and thank you everyone for attending.